Square Enix has been on a roll with most of its developed and published titles in recent years, and the Art developed tactical strategy RPG Triangle Strategy is keeping the streak going. Without spoiling anything or getting too technical just yet, this game is a must for fans of tactical RPGs with the Nintendo Switch. But those details are what's interesting, so let's get into what exactly makes Triangle Strategy such a successful entry in the genre. Before we get into the meat of the game, we need to look at its bones. The Nintendo Switch is far from a powerhouse of a console, but that has not stopped its exclusives from managing to still run well with technical ingenuity and proficient visual design. Triangle Strategy is no different, with it managing to run well without compromising on its looks. Its performance also manages to stay steady in both docked and handheld mode. The base model Switch's battery also manages to run it for a few hours in handheld mode, which is better than can be said about some of the console's other games of similar scope. Now that those bones are out of the way, we can take a look at the first course of meat: Triangle Strategy's setting and story. The game is set in the original world of Norzelia. The continent is divided between three kingdoms: Icefrost, Glenbrook, and Hyzan, and the story begins 30 years after the conclusion of the massive Salt Iron War between the three. Icefrost is the northernmost country and is the primary source of iron on the continent. It is a military powerhouse with a harsh utilitarian culture run by arrogant nobility. The easternmost part of Norzelia's countries is Hyzan, a bigoted religious state that also maintains the only source of salt. The nation is incredibly advanced medically, but the religion at the center of their culture not only keeps them from sharing those secrets, but also sees their entire nation being built on the shoulders of the enslaved pink-haired people of Rosella. Glenbrook is in between the two, with a powerful river running through it and connecting all three of the nations. This is the nation that players are associated with, as well as fostering the trading that runs across the continent. Glenbrook is a bit more generic than its two peers, but is made up of multiple houses that are prone to fighting and arguing with themselves as much as other nations. When players first start Triangle Strategy, it is extremely slow. Pressing start kicks off a procession of cutscenes that gives the player a slow drip feed of character introductions and exposition dumps that build the foundation of the world, as well as setting up the relationships of the characters in an intricate web. The character players control is Serenoa Wolffort, a young prince that inherits House Wolffort in Glenbrook after his father relinquishes his rule due to a sickness. Serenoa's inheritance is preceded by him meeting his betrothed, Frederica Icefrost, for the first time. The opening cutscenes are also focused on establishing an iron mine being founded with the support of all three kingdoms within Glenbrook. The mine plays an important role in securing peace between them by increasing the iron resources given to Glenbrook and Hyzan, bolstering the trade routes through Glenbrook, and making the crippled economy of Icefrost plenty of money. All of this exposition will likely be too slow and plodding for some players to make their way through, and it will definitely drag for anybody who doesn't love fantasy worlds and just listening to the conversations within them. However, if you enjoy scenes from the early seasons of Game of Thrones that revolve around just talking through geopolitical conflicts and relationships, you'll be right at home here. Of course, there wouldn't be much of a story to tell if something didn't go wrong, though. So that new iron mine I talked about earlier eventually goes sideways, sparking a new conflict between the kingdoms. This puts Serenoa, Frederica, Wolffort's house steward Benedict, and Serenoa's childhood friend Prince Roland trying to navigate the new war and help as many people as possible along the way. Once the story takes off, the lengthy groundwork Triangle Strategy's opening established begins to pay dividends. There is a lot of maturity in the story, with the political drives of characters interweaving with one another and being told in a deliberate and effective way. As far as fantasy video game stories go, it ditches the moral binaries and cataclysmic stakes to instead focus on personal interactions, realistic motivations, and a grounded tone of more worldly themes. Interestingly, while the main story is told in a very narrative and curated fashion, there are also side cutscenes that you can see before you select the next main mission. These are curious as they give you side information that fleshes out the motivations or planning of characters, which are often tantamount to understanding the full story. If you ever see one of these on the map, make sure you do it. Otherwise it'll be gone forever and you won't have a chance to see it again until your next playthrough. Being able to skip these may be nice for subsequent playthroughs, but it is strange to me that they are so optional and easily missed for every player off the bat. Along the way, players build a force of many characters that each have their own unique personalities and combat functionalities. The characters throughout the game don't stand up to great companions like Garrus, Elizabeth, or Cortana, but they do an admirable job of giving players different perspectives on the many layers of the world, with interesting personal stories and interactions. Unfortunately, the main cast of characters are some of the most drudgingly banal I've ever come across. The likes of Frederica, Serenoa, Roland, and Benedict all feel like carbon copies of one another. They each talk exactly the same, never get emotional or make mistakes, and they agree with one another at all times except for over the most trivial of matters.
But of course,
It would have greatly elevated the game to have more of a conflict within Serenoa's ranks for players to navigate, or even just have the characters they spend the most time with be even just a little bit interesting. Instead, they each have a small characteristic that envelops their entire being. Serenoa wants to do right by the Wolfort name, Frederico wants to free her people enslaved in Hyzant, Prince Roland doesn't like his brother, Benedict is a simp for Serenoa. I just summarized each of them in one sentence, and there's nothing more to say about any one of their personalities. Within that setting, the game can be split up into 4 phases. There's combat, exploration, character progression, and decisions. We'll first take a look at combat, the main thing players come to tactical RPGs for. Combat encounters in triangle strategy begin with the player choosing which units to use and positioning them in a starting formation in designated sections of the map. Each character has their own weapon and abilities that are unlocked as they level up, which we'll talk about when we get to character progression. The combat encounters play out through turns, with characters using fire magic, bows, swords, ice magic, healing spells, and buffs to battle one another. Each character brings an entirely different approach to battles that can be personalized by one's composition. Combat is quite punishing, with healers quickly getting killed by just 1 or 2 shots. But once one learns the nuances of its systems, the battles are expertly balanced. During these battles, players also have to account for a few different mechanics, including backstabs for extra damage, placing ranged characters up high for boosted damage, elemental effects like ice slowing movement, and having an enemy flanked on either side by characters so that when one attacks, the other gets a free attack as well. It is an intoxicating mixture that keeps Triangle Strategy's battles feeling unique and tense while keeping the approaches for winning each battle a lot more open. The arenas throughout the game are also some of the most well-balanced and varied in the genre. They constantly shift the tactical elements that need to be considered in each battle to encourage players to try things out and mix up their roster to adapt to new situations. Making 1 or 2 bad decisions in a battle can quickly spell disaster, but the difficulty is well balanced enough that they manage to never feel unfair or insurmountable. Victory is always just a smart strategy away. Apart from combat, you'll also be able to explore environments during exploration periods. These sections allow you to walk throughout a part of the world, pick up consumables, and let you talk to characters and unnamed NPCs alike. These sections are typically very brief, with the majority of lootables being base healing items and each having only a few characters to talk to. Regardless, the sections help break up the pacing of the game, and it fulfills 2 important roles in the game's structure. The first is that it allows you to gain new information that can be used during dialogues and decisions, which we'll get to in just a bit here. The second function is that it helps Triangle Strategy's world feel more alive. The game's heavy reliance on cutscenes and carefully constructed levels, it would be very easy for its world to feel restricted and narrow. The exploration segments help alleviate this feeling by giving the player the freedom to just see it in action and explore part of it at their own pace. There isn't anything too complicated or engrossing in any of these sections really, but being able to just observe and walk around a location helps solidify its identity. Earlier I also mentioned that the characters in your motley crew can level up and be upgraded as you progress through the game. This is done through a very linear and simple system that is accessed via the game's encampment. The encampment is a small military base that houses your recruited characters, a few different stores, and a vendor that gives you access to memory battles. Memory battles are drills that put you in tough tactical situations or emphasize a particular unit you'll be facing. The first you'll do puts you on a bridge, flanked on either side by enemy units, while other tasks you will do have you facing a team filled completely with mages, or trying to secure a particular objective. The memory battles are pretty varied, similarly to the real encounters, and while they are introduced as side content, it is often necessary to play them to get the crafting material rewards or to level up your characters enough to reach the recommended level for the next battle in the story. Apart from the tavern keep that gives these memory battles, one of the stores focuses on selling consumables and upgrades for your characters. Every character in your army has a personal level that unlocks better stats and new abilities, but in the encampment you can also craft upgrades for their weapons that increase their damage, health, and other stats. At this store you can also promote the classes of every character into a better version that gives you a few more abilities and options to take advantage of in battles. This progression system is sufficient and adds a nice layer of strategy when it comes to deciding which upgrades to prioritize, but it may leave some players dissatisfied with how constrictive it is compared to other series like Fire Emblem. However, that linearity does allow the developers to make a nice smooth difficulty curve that is rarely seen in this genre. Finally, the encampment also has a store where you can spend a currency called kudos rather than coin. Kudos is earned at the end of every battle for winning and performing certain tactical moves like flanks and backstabs. These can then be spent on powers that can help sway the tide of battle, as well as lore entries that give more of a background on Norzelia and its history. Finally, there are decisions, and I expect this to be the most contentious one between players. Frequently throughout the story, Serenor will be presented with choices that have a big impact on the trajectory of the story. However, rather than making the choice themselves, the player's companions vote on which decision they support, and the player then has to abide by it. The player does still have some say in the matter, however, as before the decision is made, you are able to talk to each of your companions to hear their opinion and try to sway their final decision. After you listen to their side of the debate, you can choose to persuade them by picking one of 3 responses. You then have to select the one that best applies to their logic to persuade them. But regardless of whether or not your choice works, you are left in the dark on whether or not you were successful until they vote. Sometimes you also won't have 3 options, as many are locked behind knowledge that you have to obtain by talking to other characters or finding information during exploration segments. Personally, I loved this system, but I can see why someone else wouldn't. I love games that push players to actually reason solutions or decisions out rather than having everything be decided by dice rolls or stat blocks. And I think letting players actually utilize the lore they learn throughout the game in these decisions is genius, and a great way to show that strategy can be more than what happens on the battlefield. But I also can see players getting frustrated with not being fully able to control their direction in the game, or what happens in the story, especially if they struggle with getting their companions to see things their way. And even more especially when these decisions frequently completely change what levels are visited throughout a playthrough. Moving on from the gameplay itself, we need to look at how it is presented through its music and visual design. To start, the music is mostly just adequate. It never ruins the experience or gets in the way of anything, but it often feels uninspired and lacking. It does the bare minimum of helping fill in the background and set a scene, but I can't see many players listening to most of the soundtrack outside of their time with the game. However, there are just a few tracks that pop up out of nowhere and are just great. They'll randomly incorporate different styles into its general medieval fare to sound completely unique and really bring a battle or dramatic moment to life. These tracks do wonders to boost the experience of playing through the game, but they also highlight just how lackluster the rest of the soundtrack is most of the time in comparison. The visual design does not have this issue. When Triangle Strategy was first announced under the title Project Triangle Strategy, the first thing many people commented on was its gorgeous tilt-shifted pixelated aesthetic. It's as beautiful in the game as it was in its reveal trailers and does a wonderful job of giving the game its own concrete identity while also making the world inviting as any other. The character animations tend to be a bit on the simple side, but that does little to detract from the battles or cutscenes, and the effects for special abilities are an absolute standout. Spell effects are varied and flashy, with birds of flame soaring above, explosions of ice tinkling on the ground, and gusts of wind turning enemies to expose their backs. Each one is as strong as the next, and they are well crafted enough that even seeing them dozens of times it won't make you tire of them. Triangle Strategy is a massive triumph for the tactical RPG genre. Precise combat is as interesting and tense as it is varied, its story is mature and focused, its world is deep but accessible, and every moment is simply a joy to look at. There are very few complaints that I have about Triangle Strategy, besides wishing that the main characters were a bit stronger and that some of the weaker voice acting had gotten another take or two. But these problems do very little to detract from what is a must-play for fans of the genre or fantasy world. Thanks for checking out our review of Triangle Strategy. If you want to see another perspective on the game, make sure to look at our written review on our website by Kyle. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our future reviews, or follow us on Twitch where we stream every Tuesday.